What would you endure to marry a king? Your dignity, your privacy, or your soul? Picture this, a dimly lit stone chamber, cold and silent except for the rustle of silk skirts and the hushed murmur of holy men. At the center stands a girl, barely 17, stripped from the silken layers of royalty and reduced to a trembling subject of scrutiny. Her breath is shallow, her hands tremble. Before her, a midwife approaches with cold, clinical detachment. Behind her, priests and royal counselors wait for judgment. This is no wedding. This is no celebration. This is a test. A test not of intelligence, not of love, not even of loyalty, but of flesh. A test of virginity, determined not by truth, but by touch. In this room, a girl's fate is measured by skin, muscle, and the whispers of men who have never known her name. One mistake, one suspicion, one whisper from an enemy court, and she may lose everything. These were the unspoken horrors behind the crowns and veils. For women of noble blood in the medieval world, marriage was not a promise. It was a performance, a trial, and often a quiet kind of execution. Because long before the vows were spoken, these women had already been stripped of everything except their ability to endure. But what happened to those who failed the test, and who decided they were unworthy? In the medieval world, love was not the foundation of marriage, power was. Behind every royal union stood a throne to protect, a lineage to preserve, and an empire to expand. The marriage bed was less about intimacy and more about diplomacy. It was a battlefield of silks and whispers where alliances were forged not by warriors, but by wombs. For kings and emperors, a wife was not just a partner, she was a symbol. Her body became the soil in which the next generation of rulers would be planted. Her behavior reflected the honor of the kingdom itself. Her failure could bring ruin, her success could bring peace. Virginity was not a virtue, it was currency. Untouched flesh signified a pure bloodline, a sealed promise that no bastard son would ever lay claim to the throne. And fertility. That was the crown jewel. A barren queen was a national crisis. The absence of a son could unravel years of fragile peace, but the women themselves, they had no say. These royal brides were chosen as infants, traded like porcelain dolls between courts. They were educated in silence, obedience, and restraint. By the time they came of age, their fate was sealed, their bodies destined to become political instruments. It wasn't just kings who dictated their futures. Popes, bishops, noble fathers, and even foreign spies had a hand in determining a woman's worth. In some cases, a single accusation from a rival court could derail a royal engagement. A whisper about her chastity, an old rumor about her health, and the alliance would crumble. And so, before she could ever wear a crown, a young woman was forced to submit to the most degrading rituals imaginable. She was poked, prodded, tested, not for intelligence, courage, or loyalty, but for purity, for silence, for the ability to endure humiliation without protest. Because in this world, queens were not born, they were broken into place. And the breaking began long before the wedding night. The wedding night was not a private affair. For royal brides, it was the most terrifying performance of their lives, a stage where failure was not just shameful, but politically dangerous. The ritual was brutal in its simplicity. After the consummation of the marriage, the sheets would be inspected for blood. This single stain, or lack thereof, determined whether the bride was truly a virgin when she entered the marriage bed. It didn't matter if she had passed the examination days earlier. It didn't matter if she had bled. What mattered was that blood now, at that moment, visible, verifiable, undeniable. And the witnesses. They were not lovers or friends or trusted confidants. They were servants, priests, political advisors, the ones who waited outside the chamber as the night unfolded, listening for the groan of bedposts, the cry of a girl, the rustling of linen. When morning came, the stained sheet would be paraded like a war banner, held aloft as proof of the bride's worth. In some courts, this gruesome evidence was displayed to cheering crowds. In others, it was kept behind closed doors, but discussed in whispers, recorded in journals, etched into the memory of diplomacy. The pressure was unimaginable. What if she didn't bleed? What if the king failed to perform? What if her body, worn down by stress or fear, didn't react as expected? And what if someone tampered with the sheet? In many cases, they did. Maids were ordered to apply drops of animal blood. Herbal remedies were secretly taken to ensure a tearing. Some women were taught to bite their own lips or fingertips in desperation, to fake the evidence of purity by any means necessary, but if the sheet remained clean. Accusations followed. The bride might be labeled impure, adulterous, deceitful, a witch. The marriage could be annulled, and with it all alliances shattered. The bride might be imprisoned or sent back in disgrace to her father's court, no longer maiden, no longer queen, but something broken, something ruined. Catherine of Aragon faced this agony. Her marriage to Henry VII rested on the claim that she had never consummated her first union with his brother. Years later, that very question, whether she had bled, whether she was truly untouched, became the foundation for Henry's campaign to annul their marriage. Not love, not betrayal, blood on a sheet. The echoes of that night would haunt her for decades. And so for every royal bride, the first dawn of her marriage was not filled with love or laughter. It was filled with silence, with eyes watching from shadows, with sheets, stained or clean, held high like verdicts from heaven. But what if the bride bled as expected, yet still failed in her true duty? What if she could not give the king a son? If virginity was proof of purity, fertility was proof of purpose. A queen who could not bear sons was not a wife, she was a failure. In the medieval court, a woman's body was seen as sacred real estate. Her womb was a vessel meant to carry the future of the kingdom, the beating heart of a dynasty not yet born. And if that vessel failed, the consequences were brutal. Fertility was tested in ways as humiliating as they were hopeless. Queens were forced to drink herbal tonics, often poisonous or nauseating, believed to stimulate conception. Some were subjected to primitive medical examinations, their stomachs pressed, their cycles tracked, their womanly essence measured by the color of their urine or the shape of their breasts. If they failed to conceive, the blame never fell on the king. It was always the queen. She was cursed, barren, touched by God's disfavor, or worse, by the devil's hand. Whispers of witchcraft spread like infection. Religious advisors demanded penance. Rival factions called for her removal. Anne of Austria, the Queen of France and wife of Louis XIII, endured this torment for over 20 years. Despite her royal bearing and devout faith, she could not produce an heir, and the French court turned against her. Her every move was scrutinized. Rumors swirled that she was sterile, unfit, or secretly sinful. It wasn't until late in life, when she finally gave birth to the future Louis XIV, that the shadow over her name began to fade. But even then, the damage was done. Her worth had been questioned. Her soul doubted. Fertility trials were not just about childbirth, they were about control. By tying a woman's value to her reproductive capacity, kings and kingdoms ensured that no queen could ever feel secure in her place. Her crown was provisional, her power conditional, her dignity disposable. Even the miracle of pregnancy was not enough. A queen was expected not only to conceive, but to deliver, and to deliver sons. Miscarriages were punishable by shame. Stillbirths were considered divine punishments, and daughters were often treated as failures in flesh. It was not enough to be loyal, obedient, beautiful, or clever. A queen had to bleed at the right time, swell at the right time, push at the right time. Her body was not her own. It was the kingdom's. And yet some women were subjected to even worse, not just trials of the body, but of the soul. When flesh could not be trusted and blood could be faked, there was only one force left to call upon: divine judgment. In some medieval societies, when a bride's purity was questioned and no evidence could prove or disprove her innocence, she was subjected to what was known as a trial by ordeal. These were not symbolic rituals. They were physical punishments disguised as divine tests. The idea was simple and terrifying. If God deemed the woman innocent, he would protect her from harm. If she was guilty, her body would betray her. One of the most infamous of these trials was the ordeal of the red-hot iron. The accused woman would be forced to carry a glowing metal bar across a fixed distance, sometimes just a few feet, sometimes across a courtyard. Her hands wrapped in cloth, her eyes clenched shut, she would walk while priests chanted hymns. Then her hands would be bound and sealed. Days later, the wrappings were removed. If the burns had healed cleanly, she was declared pure. If infection or blistering remained, she had failed. Another ordeal required the accused to be submerged in cold water, tied at the wrists and ankles. If she floated, she was guilty, repelled by the holy purity of the water. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned before anyone could pull her back out. Some were made to walk barefoot across burning coals. Others were ordered to plunge their hands into boiling water to retrieve a stone or coin. The injuries were severe, the scars lifelong, but it was the spiritual assault that cut deepest. These women were told that their suffering was holy, that pain was a purifier, that silence was obedience, that survival was proof of divine favor. Yet behind these doctrines lurked men who used the language of God to disguise their own fears, suspicions, and politics. In many cases, these ordeals were ordered not by clerics, but by kings and nobles, desperate to discredit a bride, dissolve a marriage, or prevent an unwanted union. And for those who survived, there was no peace. A woman who passed her ordeal might be spared execution or exile, but she would never be untouched again. Her reputation, her body, her soul, all marked by the trial. She might become queen, but her story would always begin with fire or water or blood. These were crucifixions without crosses, sacrifices without sanctity, proof that in the medieval world suffering was the price of power and survival was the only proof of grace. And still, the torment did not end. Even after the blood, the womb, the iron, she was never alone, because the final humiliation was not what they did to her, it was what they never let her escape. There was no privacy in royalty, not for a queen. Once the inspections ended, once the blood had dried and the womb had proven useful, another form of punishment took its place: constant surveillance. In the grand halls of medieval palaces, where gold shimmered and courtiers bowed, a queen's every breath was watched. Every glance, every whisper, every change in tone or expression, catalogued, analyzed, and judged. She was never alone. From the moment she awoke, ladies-in-waiting surrounded her. Her meals were served by silent observers. Her prayers were overheard. Her clothing selected and dressed by others. Even her moments of grief, the loss of a child, the fear of betrayal, the exhaustion of endless expectations, were not hers to experience privately. Marie Antoinette, though a later queen, offers a chilling reflection of this eternal cage. Her mornings began with a public ritual called the lever, during which nobles gathered to watch her wake, wash, and dress. Even her pregnancies were witnessed, her body a public theater of dynastic hope. When she gave birth, high-ranking officials stood in the room, watching to ensure the child was truly hers. But this wasn't limited to France. Across Europe, queens were turned into state-owned idols. They were adorned in jewels but imprisoned by protocol. They walked among mirrors, every word they spoke echoing into chambers of political consequence. Their bodies had once been tested for blood, then for fertility. Now they were tested for perfection. A missed smile sparked gossip. A missed period ignited crisis. A nervous glance became a sign of treason. In time, many queens stopped speaking altogether, retreating behind forced grace and practiced expressions, faces carved from duty, not desire. The symbolic weight was crushing. These women were no longer people. They were emblems of unity, morality, motherhood, power, but beneath the robes and titles lived real pain. A queen could not grieve openly, could not falter, could not age without consequence. Her body was a tool, her heart an afterthought, and the greatest cruelty. Even when she wore the crown, even when she'd passed every test, bled on every sheet, endured every ordeal, she was still not free, because the crown was not a reward, it was a chain. Behind every royal portrait hung in stone corridors, behind every gold crown enshrined in glass, lies the quiet agony of women who were tested, judged, and broken, not for crimes, but for simply being born female in a world of power-hungry men. These humiliating trials, the forced virginity exams, the blood-stained sheets, the fertility rituals, the ordeals by fire and water, the ceaseless surveillance, were not remnants of superstition. They were instruments of control, rituals designed not to reveal truth, but to impose obedience. The body of a queen was never her own. It belonged to the state, to the church, to the king, to history, and yet they endured, not because they were weak, but because they were never allowed to be anything else. Every scar, every silence, every tear held behind a practiced smile became part of a system that demanded perfection without mercy. So now we ask you, if the price of power was the complete sacrifice of your dignity, your body, and your soul, would you still wear the crown?